And there we go. And then I will start the presentation. Okay, can you all see the presentation all right?
Yes.
Perfect. And I am going to go ahead and let's see here. Well, sort that out later. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate you joining us this evening. My name is Adam Bunker. I am the operations manager for Papa Joe's Produce in Sheridan, Wyoming. I'll give a little bit more info about who we are and what we do, just so you know some of our background. But to start with, the topic of tonight is Hydroponics 101, growing without soil. This is meant to be a very entry level course. So I hope it's of use to some of you who might have some experience. The goal is to make it as simple as possible. If your experience level is just I've heard about hydroponics and I'm interested, we're gonna walk through some of the basics tonight and give you some takeaways that you can take with you if you want to get started. So on that note, like I said, today's topics, we're going to do a business overview of Papa Joe's Produce. We'll discuss core concepts of hydroponics. We'll go over kind of what a lot of the more common systems are and then some basic nutrient management. We'll walk through takeaways and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And for those of you who maybe just joined, there will be opportunity for engagement throughout this. We're going to have a couple of breaks for questions. In the meantime, just as this is going, if you have a question that comes up, feel free to put it in the chat with 3 question marks at the beginning to make it a little bit easier to call out. And then the objectives for today, kind of my goal for what I want to accomplish with this is that you would walk away with an understanding of the basics, of hydroponics, basic understanding of the different systems and their kinds of nutrients. And then my Zoom is hiding the bottom one. Oh, and then steps to get started, of course. So as I said, I'm the operations manager for Papa Joe's Produce. We actually started off in 2015 as a retirement hobby for my father-in-law, Joe Westnitzer, who is up on there, up on the screen with me there. He's been a gardener pretty much his whole life, but around 2015 got interested in hydroponics because he was helping some other people build some of their systems. So he stood up a small greenhouse of his own, filled it with some vertical hydroponic systems. A couple years later, I started helping him part-time and really just found a passion for it. So I quit my desk job, decided to go work for him. And in that time, we've now grown to 3 year-round greenhouses, 7 employees and volunteers. And we also invest quite a bit of our time in helping our community. So we believe strongly in encouraging other people to find success in growing. So we help out with our local school districts, community gardens, things like that. And putting on now we're branching off, pardon the pun, into the webinar realm. So looking to offer some free advice to folks, and then later on, maybe even some more in-depth paid classes if that's something folks are interested in. Here's a quick overview of kind of our structures. We have 2 greenhouses that are 20 by 48, and we've got a mix of some deep water culture hydroponics. That's the DWC. If you don't know what these terms are, don't worry. There's a whole section that's going to go into details on what these different things mean. Then we got our to us bigger one, 35 by 48. That one has a whole variety of stuff going on in it. We are at about 45 degrees north latitude, so we get pretty good sun in the summer. We don't get near as much sun in the winter, so we have to do some supplemental lighting. We are fortunate that we have natural gas where we're at, so we're able to heat our greenhouses that way. But honestly, the greenhouses do such a fantastic job that if it's sunny out, they will be warm. If it's not sunny, it's kind of a different story. We do have to heat them a bit. And then we use water walls, which are evaporative cooling systems, to keep things cool in the summer. We almost have more of a problem keeping the greenhouses cool enough in the summer than we do keeping them warm enough in the winter. There's been times that it was 0 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but it was sunny, so it was still 80 degrees inside the greenhouse. A few kind of an overview of our current production systems. In the upper left here is one of the deep water culture ponds. We're going to talk quite a bit more about those. In the lower left is an ebb and flow system that is absolutely, quite literally overflowing with watercress. And then in the bottom right is a different deep water culture system. This one was kit built. The first one up here we built ourselves. And I'll say there's a reason why you might want to go with a kit built. It was a lot easier and it's more well insulated. And then we do a little bit of soil growing in containers. Now, some past systems that we've grown with, just to give you some sense of our experience when we talk about different things. For a long time, we operated these vertical, these are nutrient film technique or NFT towers. We ran those for probably 7 years, I think, counting from when Joe started. We phased them out for some different considerations more on the business side as far as labor and efficiency and things like that go. They do work. You can grow a lot of things in them. You can see some basil. Joe is picking some kale. We've got lettuce. And then another type of hydroponic system on the right here is a Beto bucket or a Dutch bucket. And we'll cover those in more detail. Those worked out pretty well for tomatoes and peppers. So moving on to the main topic tonight, the hydroponics, is one of the questions we get whenever we give tours is, but how do you grow without dirt? And that's a great question. So what we have to do is kind of break down. First, we'll start off with what does hydroponics mean? What does that consist of? So, of course, you have to have a growing system of some type. There's a lot of different types out there, but you need a system of some sort that circulates the water and your nutrients, and it gives a place for your plants to grow. It might have lighting depending on where you're at. One of the things that we'll cover this up top as an important kind of vocab distinction is hydroponics versus aquaponics. The main difference is that aquaponics uses fish for the nutrients. Otherwise, the physical setups are often quite the same. But for your system, if you're doing aquaponics, you might have a separate fish tank or area that you're circulating the water through them. Now, your system may or may not include some type of growing media. That depends a lot on the systems, but that could be things like expanded clay pellets or perlite, something for the plants to root into. There are systems like the deep water culture where the plants are just suspended in the nutrient water itself. But the biggest thing, this comes back to that, how do you grow without soil? Is that the grower is responsible entirely for providing the plants with the nutrients they need and keeping the pH in balance. And there's actually a third thing in there that we'll cover on the next slide that the grower is responsible for. So here's kind of a quick overview of what hydroponics kind of boils down to is you may have lighting. You need to have some kind of structural support for your plant, whether it's something the plant just rests on, or if you've got larger crops, something that helps hold the plants up. You're going to have your water, your nutrients, and your pH adjusted. And then this is that third thing I talked about is oxygen to the roots. Now, that could be passive. Some of these systems are really good at just boosting the oxygen level of the water through their natural flow. Other systems, though, you might have to actively oxygenate that with, say, an air pump or something of the sort. Now, a big question is why hydroponics? What are the benefits of this? Well, whether you're growing at any scale, so residential or commercial, hydroponics, even though this might seem counterintuitive, is very water efficient because you recirculate the water. So you don't get loss that just soaks into the ground. If you're managing it correctly and you're minimizing how much water is exposed, you get very little evaporation. So you can really dial it in to where the main water consumption is just what the plants themselves use. It can use up to 70 to 80% less water than soil-based agriculture. It can also give you faster growth and higher yields. That's because as the grower, there's a big burden of responsibility on us to provide the plants with the nutrients, but that also means we can really tailor what nutrients the plants are getting. We can make sure they're getting everything that they need. And that makes the plants happy, and happy plants grow better. Those yields can be as much as 10 times or more higher than comparable square footage in soil-grown agriculture. And then, of course, there's space and season considerations. Hydroponics are very space efficient, some systems more than others, but overall, very space efficient. They are suited for indoor or even outdoor growing. I follow a few different hydroponic communities online, and I've seen rather impressive setups where people do their hydroponics outdoors. So it's almost like a seasonal garden in terms of how long they can grow, but they're getting the benefits of the hydroponics with all of the natural light and everything. And so they just do it seasonally. You can totally do that. Of course, if you do want to grow indoors, then hydroponics are a great way to do year-round growing. You don't have the same considerations or challenges with like soil depletion. If you tried to grow year-round in soil, you'd have to be amending that quite a bit or cycling through that. It also cuts down on pests. There's certainly pests that are still very prevalent. My life would be much easier if I didn't have any pests at all. But it really opens up the options for year-round growing if you're doing hydroponics. And I think on that note, we'll do a quick break for any questions. I don't think I saw any in the chat, but if you have one, feel free to come off of mute and throw something out.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Tyler.
What is one of the worst pests that you've had to deal with? And what do you do to mitigate the pests?
That is a great question. And I'll preface this by saying the what I built this presentation around was originally a two-parter. The entire second part was on pest management. So I think that's a topic, if there's enough people interested, we can do a whole other webinar on that. But to your question, the single biggest one we have are aphids. We'll get them quite a bit. We also deal with thrips and then powdery mildew more so in the winter when our humidity goes up. So our approach, we're not organically certified, but just for our own peace of mind, and I like being able to pick a plant and eat it, we do not use any systemic insecticides that the plants would uptake. We try and stick to as close organic management as possible. Last year, we had some pretty good success with actually using beneficial insects to help control those. And so we're really restructuring our pest management plan this year to leverage beneficial insects more than you can use, say, like neem oil is a really good interventional spray that takes care of a lot of pests, not always all of them. Neem oil, homemade insecticidal soap, those are pretty good starting points. But yeah, aphids are the single biggest one. I've literally had nightmares of squishing them in my sleep because when you get a lot of them.
Okay. Do you do anything to try to keep them from getting into your greenhouse?
We do somewhat. That's a really good question because in terms of overall pest management, one of the very basic blocks is that cultural step of it's a lot easier to try and keep them out to begin with. So in our case, some of the basic steps is we put screens on our louvers that bring in fresh air. There's only so much we can do. Part of it's kind of we got started as a hobby farm and have grown into a business. So some of the culture behind like in a real commercial greenhouse, you wouldn't ever bring in an external plant. You wouldn't buy something from the local nursery and bring it in because you don't know what it has on it. Pretty tough for me to tell my own family not to bring in their pet plants that they saw and really liked. So we focus more excuse me, sorry, I got distracted. We focus more on some basic screening and at least looking over plants before we bring them in. But other basic steps really would be don't bring in new plants. Be careful of who you let into your greenhouse. We give tours all the time, so that's kind of a moot point for us. Yeah, there's a lot more you could do that we don't because we want to show off the greenhouses, if that makes sense. Yeah, good question. Any other questions right now before we move on to the next section? All right. We'll go ahead and keep moving then. Excuse me. So next is going to be kind of an overview of all of these different hydroponic systems, some core concepts. What do they entail? We'll go into each of these in more detail, but you can see on the left side, these are those ebb and flow systems. I'll talk a bit about this. I love this picture. We put an okra plant in the middle of this bed, not having any idea what it was going to do or what it would be like. And we borrowed trouble there because you can see that okra got up to about 6 feet tall, and the beds are already about 4 feet. So it was a little tough to harvest off the top of that plant, but it was a very happy okra plant. So I do love those ebb and flow beds. You can see our vertical NFT systems, deep water culture, and then the beta buckets or Dutch buckets. But we'll step back from that for a moment because, of course, if we're going to grow plants, we have to start the plants. So with hydroponics, there's a little bit of nuance to how you start this. Two of the most common ways in which you might start your plugs are with grow plugs. These are soilless. They're made from organic materials like peat and some other things, and then they're bound with an organic polymer. So they hold together really well. You can also use rock wool, which is just spun basalt. It's basically molten rock that's spun into cubes. And that's a pretty common one for germinating your seeds. In our case, you can see this is a picture of one of our germination trays. We start our lettuce, well, almost all of our seeds in grow plugs in these trays. We foster them for about 2 weeks under some grow lights and on heat mats. And so that lets us get the plants really nice and established before we throw them in the hydroponics. Most of the time, you don't want to start your seed directly in the hydroponics. There are a couple of exceptions, but generally, you don't want to do that. It's a little bit harder to control your moisture. And so some seeds like spinach that don't like being too wet, you'll get better germination rate if you can keep them in one of these plugs that's just damp. And then also, seeds don't need nutrients. They have everything they need to get started. So when they're first getting started, if your nutrient solution is too strong, it can mess up their growth. So we've found it's much easier to go ahead and start your seeds separately in one of these two types of germination media. One thing you might use are net pots. These come in various sizes. There's a lot of different ways you can use them. If you were going to use it with one of these, then you might either find a rock wool cube that fits your net pot and you can just start it right in there, and then transplant into your hydroponic system. Or you might start in grow plugs like we do in trays, and then when you put it in your net pot, you fill it in with some other media. You really could germinate in just about anything. Some people use cocoa coir. You could plant straight in perlite, things like that. One of the things that I would give you some advice on is whatever you choose to germinate in, keep in mind you want to try and keep your hydroponic system clean. So you want something that's going to hold together. That's why one of the reasons why like a soilless media or a cocoa coir can be problematic is if it starts breaking apart, you get all those floaties in your systems, they get into your pumps, they start clogging your feed lines. You're kind of asking for trouble. So you can do it that way. And one of the great things about all of this is you get to try out all kinds of new things. That's how we've gained most of our knowledge, is trying a lot of different things out ourselves. We also did a lot of things wrong. So most of the time when I give you advice on the right way to do something, it's because I probably did it a wrong way 2 or 3 times first before I learned. But grow plugs and rock wool are really good sources. At the end of this presentation, I have a couple slides that have resources for places you can go to get these, and we'll send those out after the webinar in a follow-up email as well. Now we get to dig into some of those terms that we covered. So deep water culture hydroponics, what is that? Well, basically, it's a lot what it sounds like. Your plants float in relatively deep water. Now, our ponds are between 8 to 12 inches deep, so we're not talking deep ocean deep. It's just that compared to something where you just have a little water in there, you've got a pretty good amount of water going on. Your plants float on usually rafts, styrofoam rafts. There's a company called Beaver Plastics that makes these custom fit to different, or not custom fit, they pre-make them to different spacings. You can also build your own. One of the kits we bought just shipped with that purple insulation board, and we had to cut our own spaces in there. That was a project. But the plants float around in this nutrient-rich water. It's kind of like if you go to the pool and you've got one of those nice floaty lounge recliner things and you just float around in the water and you're nice and happy. Plants are doing the same thing. One of the things about deep water culture is that this water, because it's relatively flat, even though you might have circulation that's kind of pushing the water around your pond, you don't get a lot of air exchange. So this is a system that you do absolutely have to add air to with some kind of an air pump. Now, you probably saw in some of the pictures before, you'll see again, we have really big deep water culture ponds. But if you wanted to do this at home, it doesn't have to be big. Deep water culture doesn't necessarily mean big. You can do it in, say, a storage tote that you would get from Home Depot or Lowe's. There are kits that you can buy that are, it could be the size of a 5-gallon bucket. And really all it means is that you're going to have your plants floating in there, suspended in that kind of relatively deeper water. So it doesn't have to be big. You can easily do a very simple setup at your own house. So here's a picture of one of our greenhouses. This is the deep water culture. You can see all of our plants growing on both sides. And there's a spot where the rafts are pulled out, so you can actually kind of see right up the middle of that pond is one of our circulation trunks. So that water gets sucked into this pump, and then it gets pushed out through that trunk. There's some branches along about every 5 feet on either side of the pond. So it just creates this kind of nice, gentle flow that circulates nutrients and pH adjustments, things of that sort. And we grow, this is to give you a sense of scale, like how efficient your spacing can be. This greenhouse is a 20 by 48, and we can harvest about 400 heads of lettuce a week out of there on about an 8-week grow cycle. So a lot of room to play around there. Another thing I will say deep water culture is not necessarily good at is if you have a tall crop, something that's going to need a lot of support because there's nothing for it to root into. So really good for lettuce, spinach. You can even do kale or Swiss chard if you're only planning to do, 1 or 2 cuts off of it before they get too big. If you're wanting to do tomatoes, you can do tomatoes. You could do it in a bucket, but you'd want to give it some external support to hold that plant up. And you can build your own little mini ones. Before we pulled the trigger on building those big ponds, we did a proof of concept and just built a small pond of our own. So I just threw that in there as an idea of like a whole bunch of this. You can figure out some DIY ways to do it. Now, for those of you who might be looking to go more large scale with this, then one of the things with deep water culture, if you're going big, is you don't want to be dumping that water very often like you might with other hydroponic systems. It's a lot easier to just dump it and hit the reset button on your nutrients. So with these, because we're keeping that water around, plants uptake nutrients at different levels, you get into much more detailed long-term nutrient management. If you're growing year round, then actually managing the water of your temperature starts becoming pretty important. You don't want it to get less than 65 degrees in the winter or the roots go dormant. If it gets too much over 75 in the summer, your plants get unhappy and they start to bolt. It makes it really hard to sell the plants. And then you need to do production planning because our greenhouse kind of operates as one big assembly line, basically. We have to harvest a certain amount every week to make room for what's coming up. Those are all things that are a lot easier if you're only doing it as a hobby because you can let those plants grow as long or as short as you want. So don't let this intimidate you. It's if you're starting small, you probably don't have to worry about hardly any of these. So an ebb and flow system that I talked about, this is where you've got some kind of a container and it's filled with a growing media. It can be clay pellets expanded clay pebbles. You can even, the first couple we built, because we weren't sure about them, we filled them with washed river rock and that works well. There are some reasons why, again, going into more the business side of it, long term, there's reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. But if you're doing it as a hobby, then it can be as simple as that. And so you plant your plants into there. There is a reservoir. You have a separate reservoir that is pumping water into there. And there's kind of 2 ways to do this. The way we have it that I've diagrammed here, the water's always pumping into this. So it's always filling. And we've put a bell siphon in there. So there's an outside PVC tube. Whoops, didn't mean to go back. And then there's a drain stem in the center, and there's an inner PVC tube cap. So When the water gets higher than this drain stem, it starts flowing, and that creates a siphon that just drains the entire tub. So we can control our timing of how quickly that fills and drains by adjusting how much water goes into it. It's really easy to build. There's a great channel. This is also going to be in the resources later, but it's called Rob's Backyard Hydroponics. This is actually where we got the idea from. He walks you through how to build this yourself. Super easy to do. And one of the nice things about this is if the power goes out, there's a really good chance you've got some water in this system. Unless the power goes out, like happens to catch you in the middle of a drain cycle, you're going to have some water left in this system, and a lot of this media is going to have a lot of moisture in it. So you don't have to worry too much about your plants for quite a while. They're going to have good moisture. It's quite resilient to if you're worried about power interruptions. The second way you can do these, though, is instead of designing a drain system, is you just have a single feed and drain line from your pump, and you put it on a timer. So have it come on for 5 minutes every hour. It'll pump water into that system. Just make sure you have an overflow so you don't end up with water on your floor. And when the 5 minutes is up and the pump is done, then the water drains back down the same line. If you were to go buy a kit from just something to set up in your house or your garage, that's the way that a lot of those kits are designed, is just a single feed and drain line. So pretty straightforward. One of the advantages of this system is it does give something for your plants to root into, so it works really well for long-term crops. We grow a lot of our kale in this, and we keep our kale we have some that are going on almost a year old. We just harvest the oldest leaves and let the plant keep growing because it's nice and supported. It stays in. Basil, same thing. Swiss chard, same thing. But we've done peppers and tomatoes. One of the other really cool things about these ebb and flow systems is because that water's constantly rising and then falling, your plants always have moisture, but they're also getting fresh air because when that water drains, it pulls fresh air to the roots. That makes these systems really good at cloning plants. You can just take a cutting off a plant, stick it in there, and there's a really good chance it'll root. This is how we propagate most of our tomatoes. If we want to try a new variety, I'll buy seed the first time. And then once we have healthy plants, we just take cuttings and stick them in here. Don't even have to do rooting hormone. And that balance of having access to water and nutrients, but then also fresh air so you don't suffocate that cutting, they do really well at cloning. They're pretty cool. So there's another picture of that one has watercress, which if you can find a customer for watercress is an excellent hydroponic crop. It will go bonkers. And it doesn't store very well. It doesn't transport well. So that makes it a premium product for some of the bulk supply companies like Cisco, US Foods. They have to charge a lot for it. If you can grow it and sell it to a local restaurant, I bet there's a really good chance you can actually you can compete. You could undercut the cost from some of those bulk suppliers. That's not usually the case for us local growers. In our case, we just had a hard time finding customers who would take enough of it. In the summer, we were pulling 4 pounds a week of watercress off these 2 beds. And at that time, I think, well, I won't name names, but one of those major companies was selling it for about $100 a pound because it was a special crop. So fun to grow, kind of hard to sell in our case, but depending on where you're at, you might have an easier time. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Skipped ahead a little bit. All right. So I talked about the versatility of these ebb and flow systems. You can also grow root crops in these quite well. That's a daikon radish. That was probably about 2 pounds after we cut the leaves off. Um, it's pretty fun. You can direct seed things into this. I talked about how normally we start our seeds in those grow plugs, but these ebb and flow systems, you can direct seed things. And then the trick is to just top water them for a little bit until your seedlings are established. And then by then they're feeding off your hydroponics. So we've done radishes, shallots, carrots did okay. Lots of different types of radishes. So the one thing to keep in mind there is from a food safety standpoint, if you're looking to do it commercially, you have to keep in mind how someone's going to use that product. And so if it's a root crop that's not typically going to get cooked, you have to kind of keep in mind what gets introduced to your system. If it's something that's going to get cooked, or if you're just playing around with it on your own, then, just be careful. Wash your hands before you play with your hydroponics. That's pretty good advice no matter what. All right. Another system, this is probably one of the more common ones that you may have seen, is a nutrient film technique, or NFT. So in this case, the plants usually grow in a lot of times a net pot, or they might be straight into some media, but they're going to be in little troughs, and the water just kind of constantly flows across them. So you're always giving them a steady supply of that nutrient-rich water, and it pumps in one end, it drains out the other. You can chain a bunch of these together. And this is also where you can turn these vertically. So even though they're vertical, it's pretty much still the same concept. You're flowing water across the roots, so it's still an NFT system. Even those grow towers that y'all may have seen, where you've got net pots kind of stuck in the side and water sprays on them, even that would really be pretty much the same concept as a NFT. So this works out really well. There's lots of flexibility. Depending on how your system's set up, they can be good for short, medium, long-term growth of plants. Just it does depend on the system, because if you grow them for a long time, the roots will get big to the point that they can clog your system. So if you pick a system with a really little trough, maybe don't grow tomatoes in it for 10 months, or you'll have some issues. All right. Now another one. With this being a very entry-level beginner type course, this is a method of hydroponics called the Kratky method. Is about as simple as you can get if you just wanted to play around with something. You can take a 5-gallon bucket and just cut a hole in the lid for one of those little net pots, or just any way that you can suspend your plant in it. Get your plant started. You want a little bit of some roots established, and then you suspend it over there, and you just fill the water up just enough that it's touching the roots, but not that it's covering the entire root ball. And you're gonna, with that water, you do need to put nutrients into it. You want to make sure the pH is balanced. But then at that point, you can just let it go, because the idea is that as the plant uses the water and nutrients, that water level is going to drop. It's going to grow more roots. Those roots need oxygen. So as the water level drops, it creates this oxygenated area for them to get what they need. But the bucket is sealed, so they're not going to dry out. And in terms of nutrients, especially if you do short-term crops like lettuce or other leafy greens, by the time your plant's ready to harvest, you shouldn't really have any nutrient imbalance issues. So very simple. If you just want to play around with it, you can give this a shot. If you wanted to grow things longer term and have to refill that water, then you just go to the pet store, buy a little air pump for a fish tank, drop an air stone in there, and now you've converted your Kratky method to a very cheap and easy deep water culture system. Some other types that I'll just touch on, some of which we've grown, some we haven't, are those Beto or Dutch buckets. In that one, you basically have a little drain line that allows standing water of about 2 to 3 inches at the bottom. So usually you put your pumps on a timer, and it just pumps some of that nutrient solution across the perlite at top. So it goes down through the root zone, but then it never overflows. That's pretty good at growing, again, especially long-term stuff. These grow towers that are fairly ubiquitous nowadays, pretty much an NFT system in a different packaging. And then aeroponics is a different style in which you have your plant suspended, and instead of being in water, you actually just mist the roots with a nutrient solution from time to time. That's one we have not done, but one of these days we really want to take a run at doing some aeroponic potatoes, because that sounds cool. So for all of you out there choosing a system, there's a lot of options out there. So how do you decide what to choose? Well, just look at some pretty basic questions. What do you want to grow? Do you want to grow pretty easy short-term stuff like lettuce and leafy greens? Or do you want to grow something that you want to have a year, 2-year-old tomato plant where it's going to need to have support? It's going to need to have pretty good access to water that you don't have to refill every day. Some of your site conditions, you do want to consider your water supply. And I will mention that at this level of hydroponics, I'm not going to talk too much about like testing your source water and how that affects your strategies, because we're here as fairly entry level folks. What I will say on that though is if you have well water, you might want to get that tested, because we used to use well water and the problem was ours was very high in sodium to a point that it was problematic for plants. So if you're wanting to use well water, you might want to have that tested. There's some pretty affordable options to do that, just to see if it's going to be worth growing in. But otherwise, if you're planning to use regular municipal water, or if you have access to rainwater, other forms of clean water, probably don't have to worry about this to get started. Season selection might affect it. Are you going to grow outside and you want your system to be easy to set up and take down when it's the end of the season? Lighting and power availability. If you're going to grow year round, do you have enough power for your lights, and where are you going to put everything? Time commitment is a big one. Do you want to take the time to really micromanage your plants and keep a close eye on it? With the vertical towers, that's one of the potential issues, is sometimes those feed lines get plugged and then your plants die because they don't get water. So if you don't want to check them every day, then that might not be a good option. But if you like looking at your plants every day, then sure, go for it. And then scale of system. Are you doing this just for yourself to see if you can do it? Are you doing it to grow food for your family? Or are you looking to make a business out of it? Those different systems scale up differently from a business standpoint. This is a good time for us to go ahead and do another pause for questions before we move into nutrients, which is going to be a pretty short section. But yeah, we'll stop here. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or go ahead and come off mute.
Yeah, Adam, not a question. I just wanted to vouch for the scalability of crack key downward. I've seen crack key systems made from yogurt containers, from orange juice jugs, from all kinds of things. So like any food safe sort of container that you might happen upon, you could make a really small, really easy crack key system as a beginner.
Excellent point, Jade. Thank you. And I was remiss at the beginning when I did introductions. Jade is actually one of our members of the Papa Joe's produce team. She helps run all of our social media and marketing communications. So yeah, and she's actually gone to school for this stuff, whereas I learned on the fly, and I've done a lot of research over the last 6 years. Yeah, if you've ever taken like a basil plant cutting from the grocery store and stuck it in a jar of water and got it to root, congratulations, you did a crack key method. Tyler, go ahead.
Have you ever experimented with the aquaponics?
We have not. I've spent some time learning about it. Um, there's a whole lot more to manage, but Jade is studying aquaponics and has taken some classes. So I'll let her talk a little bit more about that. But for Papa Joe's, we haven't really done that. We've built some for other people.
Yeah, I've interned at an aquaponics farm, and I'm a really huge fan of it. I would say it's a different monster altogether. You are less so managing nutrients because the fish waste is what provides the nutrients to the plants, and you're more so managing the ranges of tolerance and environments for both your fish and the plants, and making sure those things stay in a compatible range so that the both types of organisms stay healthy. And I think it's a great thing, but it's a lot bigger. If you want to do an at-home aquaponics system, you can literally put herbs on top of your fish tank, and yeah, I would look that up. But that's kind of the small scale side of it. If you want to get into aquaponics at any larger scale, I would definitely say do your research big time.
Thank you.
I was at a presentation that was put on by actually now one of Jade's professors, and this was a gentleman who's been doing aquaponics for 30 years. And his advice was only go into aquaponics if you want to be a fish farmer. And even then, most of your money will come from the plants. But you should only do that if you really care about raising fish. If all you want to do is grow plants, you're better off going with straight hydroponics because it's a bit easier.
Have you ever heard of using or growing shrimp?
No, I haven't.
I was just curious if you could do shrimp in aquaponics, if it was possible. But
That's a good question. Jade, what do you think about that?
You know, I off the top of my head, I can't quite remember what I've heard about this, but I have heard that there are some hangups. So obviously you can't grow as much produce in saltwater, and a lot of shrimp are saltwater, but not all shrimp. So yeah, I don't know. I do know that you can't do it with certain types of shellfish like lobsters because they're territorial and they will kill each other. So it's hard to concentrate them enough to produce enough waste to produce enough nutrients because they kill each other off. So when you're choosing a species, you do have to like kind of become an expert in that species, what temperatures they need, what levels of oxygen, is that even feasible with your energy budget? So yeah, not sure about shrimp exactly though.
thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Any other questions for now? Let's see, a question in the chat. What is the best type of fish? Yeah, what is the best type of fish for a small scale fish tank? Jade, do you want to take that one as well?
Sure, yeah. So I would say any fish, but what I see the most in tanks that are used for aquaponics is like koi and goldfish, various of those carp types, because they're hardy or easy to replace. I don't know that I would rely on exotic types of fish that require more space or anything like that, because then really the consideration is getting enough creatures to produce the waste so that the plants can actually grow. So if you have, like one exotic fish, two exotic fish, they're not gonna create enough nutrients for the plants. So, but yeah, mostly koi, goldfish, things like that.
All right. Any other questions before we move on to the last section? Let's see. Okay, a question in the chat. When a tower's feed lines get junked up with root matter, what's the best way to clean and keep maintained? That's a very good question. Um, so the simplest way, this is the way we had to do it, was to actually, and it showed confidence in our water quality, was to take the feed line out of the tube and just blow through it ourselves, because there'd just be a little bit of some plant sludge in there, or when we were using well water, we would get a lot of scaling. So you can just blow it out, or you can make little pokers out of pipe cleaners. Those would work really well to just kind of ream that out a little bit. And then in terms of keeping maintained, that's where using city water makes a huge difference, because you don't have nearly the same type of mineral buildup that you would get from well water. But if you have problems with that, then one thing you could do is, if you're not constantly growing, like if you plan a break between crops, then you could run a little bit of like a vinegar solution, or if you're using a different pH down product for your hydroponics already, you kind of bump up the pH, or excuse me, you increase the pH down, which will decrease the pH. I just had to say that, very confusing. You'd basically make it a little bit more acidic and run it through your system, and that should help clear out any scaling that's built up. It's kind of like cleaning a coffee maker, basically. But in terms of that, if it's starting to get junked up, then pipe cleaners, or just a stretch of, you could straighten out a coat hanger depending on the size of your feed lines, and just kind of run that through there. That should clear it up pretty quickly. What are the best crops to grow in a tower? Well, there's lots. So in general, in almost any system, lettuce is one of the easiest crops you can grow. So it's a great starter crop. Depending on the size of your tower, so if you buy one of those towers where the net pots kind of sit in the side, you'll want to keep in mind that that doesn't provide a lot of room for root mass. So tomatoes would probably be pretty difficult, but anything that's a small leafy green or an herb would do quite well in those. Excuse me, if you had a vertical tube more like what we were growing, where the plants can really root into that whole tube, those tubes were filled with kind of like a pond filter material. So really the plants could root into that entire 4-inch tube. And so if you've got something like that, then you can grow even some bigger stuff. But in general, I'd say if you're getting those kits, then keep it to stuff that has fairly kind of small root structures, lettuce, herbs, leafy greens, things of that nature. All right. Any other questions? You're very welcome. Okay. We'll go ahead and move on to the next section, and hopefully we should end up with a little bit more time at the end. So if you do have questions that you've thought of, then we'll find a way to get to them. So I'm calling it simplified nutrient management, because when you get to kind of our scale, there's a whole lot more that goes into it. But to get started with, it doesn't have to be very intimidating. What you'll need to get started with your system is a couple of nutrient blends, because as the grower, you're providing all of the nutrients to your plants. Now there are organic options out there. In our case, we go with more synthetic fertilizers that have different nutrients in them. And so if you're going that route, if you're wanting to I want to go buy a kit and I want to get it up and running, then you're going to want to look for, if they're selling it, it's going to be either a 2 or 3-part blend. I'm going to cover that in more detail on either the next or the slide after that. So don't worry, we'll get to it and why it should be a 2 or a 3-part blend. But basically, you'll need some nutrients. You will need a way for checking and adjusting your pH range. So there's lots of pretty simple, pretty affordable little pH meters out there. It might look something like that. There's a few different designs. A common range for most hydroponic plants is going to be in that 5.5 to 6.5 range. And that's because if it's outside of that range, at a chemistry level, it starts locking nutrients out. So you could have all the nutrients in there your plant might want, but if your pH isn't right, then it can't actually uptake those. In terms of adjusting pH, there's a lot of products out there that are made specifically for hydroponics. I do think it's worth getting those. For pH down, you could use vinegar. One of the challenges with that is it tends to break down a bit faster than other acidic compounds, and it might promote microbial growth that can cause some other issues. So if you're just looking to play around and get started with like a crack key method, by all means, use some vinegar if you need to bring down your pH. If you're wanting to really set something up that you're going to count on for some food from your kitchen, I think it's worth getting one of the hydroponic pH down products. And same for pH up. That one, I think it's baking soda is the one. No, baking powder. Sorry. Don't use baking soda because it's sodium carbonate. You don't want to put sodium into your systems. But potassium carbonate is okay, because potassium is one of the nutrients the plants need. And then the other thing that you'll want to check and keep an eye on is your EC. This is another of those vocab words. That's electroconductivity. That's a fancy word for saying how much nutrients are in your water. So basically, it fires a small electrical signal through the water, and the more of those nutrient salts that are in there, the more conductive it is. So most of these meters that you look at will do both pH and EC. So it doesn't tell you the breakdown of the nutrients in there, like your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratios. It just kind of tells you the overall level of everything. Now, your EC levels can be crop specific. Some crops will won't tolerate a higher level, some really need a higher level. And so you'll want to just whatever crop you pick, you can just do a Google search. There's tons of resources out there. And just, okay, lettuce is about a 1.2. We run ours higher for other reasons, but at home, like 1.2 EC, and you're good to go. One of the cool things with this, as you get more comfortable and you found like, all right, I've grown a couple of different crops, I've got some cycles, I haven't killed my plants, is adjusting that EC can actually affect crop flavor. When we first started doing tomatoes, we grew them both in soil and hydroponics because we wanted to compare both how they grew and how they tasted. And when we started off with kind of the standard recommendations on nutrient levels for hydroponics, the tomatoes grew really well, but they had almost no flavor to them. And that's where a lot of times people think, oh, hydroponic means no flavor. A lot of the tomatoes you get in the grocery store this time of year are hydroponically grown. Well, when we actually increased the nutrient level above what was recommended to induce a stress in the plant. And that forced them to change what they were putting into the fruit. And we were able to dial in the flavor of that fruit to where it was just as good as the soil grown. So that was a neat little experiment. The reason companies aren't going to do that are selling to the grocery store is because they're on a contract for volume, not flavor. So you wouldn't put any more inputs in than you absolutely had to. But that's kind of a more advanced thing. That's like get a couple of things under your belt, and just first goal of hydroponics is keep the plants alive. And I'll say from personal experience, some days we don't do that. So it's okay if you don't. So the components of a basic nutrient recipe, this is for a 3-part recipe. This is kind of what most of our stuff is built around, is you're going to have something that's probably going to be kind of crop specific for your base formula. And thank you. I did see a question in the chat, so thank you for that. Don't worry, we won't forget. We'll circle back to that. And whatever this base formula is, it's going to control most of your NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium ratios, and it's going to include most of your micronutrients. So that's kind of the building block. You need magnesium sulfate. That's going to give your magnesium and sulfur, other critical elements. Sometimes these two will be combined, the base formula and your mag sulfate, and then you're going to have calcium nitrate, and that's the only source of calcium for the plants. Now, these are split apart because if you try and combine calcium with these other two in too strong a dose, then they'll actually mix, they'll combine, they'll form a precipitate, they'll fall out of your water, and your plants can't get to them. So that's why you have to mix them separately. I'll walk through that on the next slide, but that's where, when I said you want to look for either a 2 or a 3-part formula, if you find a formula that's just one part and it says it has everything, there's a really good chance it doesn't, because it's very difficult to actually blend all of these together into a single-use formula. Interestingly, if you use like Miracle-Gro in your garden, if you turn that over and look at what are all the nutrients in it, very few of those, except for a couple of their organic formulas, have calcium nitrate in it. So when they say this is the only fertilizer you have to give your tomato and pepper plants, that's not true. You probably still have to supplement calcium to them in some way for them to grow properly. So if you've been using Miracle-Gro and still getting a lot of blossom end rot, they're probably low on calcium because it's not in there. So for an example of what that recipe looks like, if we were preparing 100 gallons of a nutrient solution at about a 1.2 EC level, we get a 5-gallon bucket, fill it about 3/4 full. You do that so that you have room to mix. So when the water starts spinning around, it doesn't just come out over the top all over your boots. And then you start with your base formula. In this case, we'd add about 8 ounces to get what we want. Mix that until it's really well dissolved. We would then add the magnesium sulfate, mix that till it's really well dissolved. And then we would add the calcium nitrate, mix that till it's really well dissolved. That's because if we tried to mix all three together, these two second parts are going to combine, fall out, our plants can't use it. So that's just kind of a basic example. There are different products that have slightly different recommendations on how to make them. As long as you follow the instructions that come with it, you should be just fine. All right. So now we're kind of moving into the end of this. We're coming up on another question section here real soon. So as we wrap this up, some key strategies, my recommendations to you, if you're looking to get started, is number one, set yourself up for success. Don't overcommit. Think about how much time and effort you want to put into this. What are your goals for it? And just do what you think you can reasonably do. Don't sign yourself up for a project that's going to take, 3 times a day checking if that doesn't fit for you. Choose easy crops. It's a lot easier to get the basics of managing a system down with something that's fairly simple and forgiving like lettuce instead of going to something that's a lot more advanced or needs different, very specific nutrient levels. And then in terms of building your systems, do it yourself is great, but only if you like to. If that's not your thing and you would rather just buy an off-the-shelf kit and so you can get started sooner, that's totally fine. If you do like building it yourself, there are tons and tons and tons of resources out there, especially on YouTube, of how to build different systems. A lot of our ideas we've taken from there and then adapted as we've scaled up. My second piece of advice is don't expect to be perfect. Just expect to get better. Something somewhere, sometime will go wrong. Just count on it. I can tell you again from my own personal experience, out of all the people at our company, I've made the biggest I have killed thousands of plants through various mistakes here and there along the way, thought or just made them underperform because nutrients weren't dialed in. I hope I'm not undermining your confidence in us to present on this. Our team has gotten very good at our jobs. We've just learned it the hard way. So something will go wrong. Just count on that and learn from it when it does. Often you can learn more from what went wrong and then improve your system to make your plants grow better than what went right. Because sometimes they're happy and it's hard to tell what you did right to make them do that. But do pay attention to your plants. That's item 3 here, because if something's going wrong, especially on the nutrient side, your plants will tell you. If they just don't look right, there's different sources out there. You could look up, for example, lettuce nutrient deficiency symptoms. There's picture guides that will let you diagnose kind of what's going on. So just pay attention to your plants. If they look off, then just start kind of digging around into what might be causing that, and you'll be able to find the answer. And then use strategies that fit your availability. So again, do what's going to fit, set yourself up for success. An example I have here, though, if you're doing a small hobby system, then over time, the nutrients are going to get out of balance in there. So instead of you can manage that if you want to take the time to sample your nutrients with a lab and adjust your recipes and buy a lot more ingredients, but that's not a good fit for most people. So instead of holding on to that, is the strategy can be when it's time, every month or so, go ahead and just take the water out of your system and you can repurpose that to feed your plants or your outdoor garden because it does have plenty of good stuff in it. But then hit the reset button on your hydroponic system. You can leave the plants in there, but fill it with fresh water and rebalance your nutrients. So use strategies that fit what your goals are and your availability to execute. Now, these are some of the takeaways. These resources we'll put into our follow-up emails to you. YouTube, lots of ideas out there, like I said. Another shout out to Rob's Backyard Hydroponics. They have fantastic ideas on things you can build yourself. Hydro Builder is a really good resource. They have growing systems. If you want to just buy something that you can set up and get going, they'll sell the clay media. They have all of the net pots. They usually have germination material, pumps if you're looking to build your own stuff. I mean, they are really a great all-around source. Greenhouse Megastore is another one. They're also a good source for nutrients. Greenhouse Megastore is one of the better ones that I've found. And they pretty consistently have a deal that if your order is over $150, no matter what it is, you get free shipping. So if you wanted to go buy a hydroponic system and get some nutrients, then you could probably get free shipping. And then Port Americas, they do sell most of these other things, but what I like to call them out for is that they have a very extensive knowledge base. So if you're looking to really do some further reading and learning in this, they just have a great resource to read through. Additional takeaways, if you're looking to get started, there's lots of different seed companies out there. We use a few, but one of my favorites is Johnny's Selected Seeds. They have lots of options. And one of the nice things is that they've taken the time to test different crops for what are good hydroponic performers, and they call that out on their site. So it's really easy to filter different options to see what's a proven hydroponic performer, or even just general greenhouse production. iHort is a great source for buying these grow plugs. I've been working with them quite a bit recently, and their staff has been very helpful. That's one thing I've enjoyed about them. And they sell actually a large variety of grow plug options. So if you're looking to do something kind of funky, they don't have to be small plugs. They've got 6-inch blocks of this stuff if you want to do something big. And ZipGrow is another option for these grow plugs. They're another kind of industry leader. If you look around, you'll probably come across their products. They also do growing systems and some other types of growing media. I think they carry the rock wool. So yeah, there's a few different places to get started. So that kind of brings us to our final, as we wrap things up this evening, our final Q&A section. I am going to throw up our contact info for your information while we work through this. I'll first circle back to Brian's question from the chat. He said he has a meter with EC and TDS. What is better? So in general, with hydroponics, you want to go through with the EC. I'll be honest, I don't recall exactly the difference between the two, but I believe it has to do with some of the salt concentrations, and that there are some things that will influence your TDS that may not show up on EC, and vice versa. Jade, is that track pretty closely?
For sure. And additionally, just on a practical level, you're going to find so many more resources that are talking in EC. So even if they're a decent enough analog for each other, which at their core, the reason they're both on the meter is that they sort of are telling you a similar thing, like how much is in your water. You're going to want to read an EC because you're going to be able to diagnose problems more easily through Google, because everyone in hydro talks in EC.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. Thank you. All right. Other questions about anything we've covered, or greenhouses in general, pests? Feel free to ask.
I have a question about the seed propagation and starting those medium.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I mean, we didn't start seeds we're planting in soil, but we also started the seeds in a seed starter instead of buying the plugs. Do the plugs have nutrients? I think you touched on it earlier, but I don't remember what the answer was.
That's a good question. The plugs themselves don't really have nutrients. They might have a little bit. They're loaded a little bit so that they don't suck up the nutrients from your water when you do plant them in. Like if you start adding some fertilizer to your germination trays, they're preloaded to have a slight EC to them so that the peat itself doesn't absorb your nutrients instead of the plants and bind to it. But in general, they're fairly inert. They're not going to affect your pH or your EC. So really, you just have to, you're pretty much responsible for fertilizing them once they've got their first true leaf.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The plugs do transplant very well into soil too, by the way. That's actually how we start most of our soil grown crops, is still in those plugs, because it's so much easier to control the moisture for germination rates. And then we just plant them into soil pots instead. Let's see, I think it looked like Tyler was getting ready to ask a question, and then I see David's question in the chat. So we'll go Tyler, then David.
I was just wondering, like, if you were to start, I got a well and it might not be the best water. Um, how would you treat that well water before putting it into a system?
That is a really good question. So I would recommend having a test done to just see how much of a problem it might be. We'll send out in our follow-up a link to, there's a company called Quality Analytical Laboratories. They're out of Florida, but they're actually the cheapest I've found around for running these kinds of tests. And so a source water test is like, I think $45 plus the shipping to send them a bottle of water. But even without that, the the most sure way to treat your water is with a reverse osmosis system, but that gets really expensive. So what I'd say is you could try growing in it. I mean, our well water, we did successfully grow with it for quite a while, and it had about 60 parts per million of sodium, which is about twice the level that's considered to potentially cause growth problems with lettuce. And for a while, our lettuce did pretty good in it. So the thing you'll want to keep in mind if you use well water is you'll want to change it out much more frequently, because that's the big problem with sodium is since the plants don't uptake it at all, then every time you add water, you're adding more sodium to the system and it's going to just build and build until it becomes a problem. So you could try working with it, and if it's not too high, you certainly can use it. You'll just want to change it out quite a bit more frequently to prevent that sodium buildup.
Okay. Are there any kind of bacterias or anything that are possible in your well water that could transfer into the food?
Another great question. It is possible. Um, I recently did a food safety refresher course, and they were talking about having, it's rare. It depends on the depth of your well, of course. They mentioned, though, very rarely, but having seen E. coli test positive in well water from 100 feet down. And so that's something if you were worried about it, like, do you have a lot of livestock around the well, or is it pretty
Yeah,
consigned?
just horses at the moment.
Okay. So th- you can get it tested for E. coli as well to make sure.
Okay.
I think that's a good question because that is one of the things with hydroponics is it's warm and it's wet wherever that media is. So it's a great place for bacteria to grow and thrive. So trying to keep them out of there, it's more a matter of you don't want the food to contact it. Not many of those will that the plants can actually uptake. I've heard it both ways that there's been some studies that showed E. coli and other pathogens, some plants will uptake them and can persist for up to 2 weeks. I've also heard other things say it's not possible. So, in general, if you're not letting the part you're going to eat touch that water, you're probably okay. And if you're cooking with it, then it's fine. Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. All right. So, David had a question in the chat. How do you manage your successional planting for lettuce? Great question for us because it's all one big assembly line. Is I went from a desk job to growing plants to then we scaled up and now half of my job is back to being a desk job. It's quite a bit of math, but basically I figure out our square footage that we have available for those rafts, and I know we're on an 8-week grow cycle. So right now what we're doing is 3 weeks in germination trays, 5 weeks in the rafts. I divide up my square footage into 5 different batches because that's my 5 weeks of growing. And however much space I have for each batch, that's how many rafts I can plant. And so that tells me the numbers that I can start every week. And then we just move everything through on that schedule. So that's the short version. Since we go year round, we do get into some seasonal fluctuations where things grow faster in the summer and things grow slower in the winter. So I'll try and anticipate those and adjust that. Then it comes back to, well, are we on an 8-week cycle or are we on now a 9-week cycle or a 7-week cycle? I have to kind of anticipate that and change how much we're going to grow because the goal is we want the greenhouses full at any given time. Otherwise, empty space doesn't make money in our case. So it's just kind of it would be similar to growing a soil crop where you look at what are your days to harvest and then you kind of plan from there on when to start your crops and do successional planting. It's the same thing, just based on what your square footage is and what crop you're going to grow. Did that answer your question, David? I think. Well, I hope so. If not, go ahead and drop in another chat. Okay. Other questions?
I I have a question. Say for lettuce, what's the like most basic troubleshooting for each phase of growth? So like if you were to seed lettuce and had a difficult time germinating, what would you troubleshoot? And then once it starts growing, if it's stunt, like if you see a couple different problems, what are common ones and how would you troubleshoot that? Just like for somebody who's never grown lettuce before.
That is a great question. So on the germination side, and I would say these are the two biggest things for anything you're trying to germinate, not just lettuce. What we've seen is its temperature and its moisture level. So I mentioned our spinach earlier. When we were growing spinach, for previously when we got started, how we were germinating things, we'd put the seed in those grow plugs, they'd be in their trays. Excuse me, we would just put water down beneath those trays so they were constantly saturated. And that worked okay for the lettuce, but our spinach, we were getting 25% germination rates. So then what we switched to was just we'll fill our trays with the plugs, soak them in water till they're saturated, but then pull them out of water, plant them, but then we just keep an eye on them until they germinate. We don't add any more water. We might miss them if they're drying out. So we're just trying to keep those seeds a little bit damp, and we don't add any more like water to the tray, significant water, until they've germinated and they're established. That took our spinach germination from 25% to about 90%. And we found that's the case with peppers, tomatoes, lettuce. You know, if you're not getting good rates, that'd be the first thing I look at is, are you overwatering your seeds? And the second thing then is temperature. That's a timely question. We've been making some tweaks to our growing media, or our growing system, I should say, and put in heat mats for all of our trays. And we've just recently found that our romaine variety doesn't actually like being on the heat mats, and they're not turned up very much. They're only set to about 70 degrees, but our germination rate's been about 80% if we put those trays on the heat mats, compared to about 95% if we just leave it in a room temperature but kind of cool, dark place until they've germinated. So two biggest things for any crop is improve your germination by making sure you don't overwater and making sure you have the temperature at what the seed says. And anywhere you buy seed should give you guidelines on how hot or cool to keep the seeds. Peppers like it really hot, like 80 or 90 degrees. When we put them on heat mats and cranked it up, we got almost 100% germination rates compared to like 80% before. So at the other stages, it kind of depends on what's going on. It comes back to that thing of just paying attention to your plants. If you're growing indoors, one of the most common problems is that your plants aren't actually getting enough light. Even if you think you've got pretty good grow lights, if they're looking really leggy, then that would be the first thing that I'd look toward is your light. There are some pretty cheap light meters that you can get off Amazon. I picked up one for like $60 that has really helped us dial in our lighting. So if they're getting leggy, that's probably the problem. And then if they're outside, if they're just not looking right, a lot of the times I usually look to nutrients of some sort. If you know they're getting enough light and you know they're getting enough water and nutrient, or excuse me, water, then it's probably a nutrient issue. If you have a small system, then troubleshooting, easiest thing would be, if you've only got a couple gallons in your reservoir, just dump it and make a fresh batch of nutrients, because that's an easy thing to do, and then see if it makes a difference. All right. Other questions? All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. I do appreciate everyone's time this evening and joining us. This was the first webinar that we put on as Papa Joe's Produce. So in our follow-up email, we'll be including a little feedback and survey. We would love to hear from all of you on how we can improve. We'd like to keep doing more of these. One of the things that we'll ask is kind of what topics would you be most interested in, and also at what level. So there's, hydroponics, pest management, greenhouse management, crop planning, seeding and germination. There's a whole bunch, and we'd like to keep encouraging other people to grow. So if you have time when that comes through, we'd love your feedback so we can get more refined at these going forward. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you. Stop recording now.